Joining me today is a senior fellow and distinguished chair in diplomacy and security at the RAND Corporation. Previously, he has held State Department and White House posts, including Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, Special Assistant to the President for the Western Hemisphere, Special Advisor to the President, Secretary of State for the Balkans, and Ambassador to the European Community. He has served under George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, and in 2013, he returned to the State Department to become the Obama administration's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ambassador James Dobbins, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thank you.
That was the longest intro I've ever read.
Yeah, well, I never could hold a job.
Yeah. We actually cut a little bit out of that just so that, for brevity's sake, I could have done an hour just reading your resume. That is quite a resume. How does someone build a resume like that? How did you even get into this world that would lead to all of those jobs that we're going to spend the next hour talking about?
Well, I mean, partly joining the American Foreign Service gets you a pretty broad spectrum. I mean, you're supposed to change jobs every 2 or 3 years, change countries, change languages. I think my pattern has perhaps been a little more eclectic than others. It's partly luck, just being in the right place at the right time. My first assignment was to Paris, and LBJ launched the Vietnam peace talks, and I was attached to it just because I was there, and spent a year with Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance trying to negotiate peace in Vietnam. That was just pure serendipity.
Yeah. When you look back at all the years that you've been involved in this, does it seem like things have changed a lot, or in a weird way have things not changed so much?
I think things have changed a lot in the last year.
The last year specifically.
After I think 50 years of continuity. I mean, I think the Cold War was all of a piece. Things alternated on a fairly narrow band. There was a debate between doves and hawks, but it wasn't a politically polarized debate. The hawks weren't all Republicans and the doves weren't all Democrats. Quite the contrary. You had many hawks in the Democratic Party and doves in the Republicans, and so the debate was of a different character. And although the world seems more complex, there are 170 countries. When I started, there were only 40 or so. If you look back at the kinds of problems that Harry Truman faced at the end of the Second World War, kind of say, things are not really worse today. I mean, there was famine, there were huge population transfers, there were countries developing nuclear weapons that were dedicated enemies of the United States. And so, in that sense, we should be a little modest in expecting that our world is so much more complicated and so much more demanding than that of those who came before us.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that too, because it seems to me that, and partly because of social media and the way we get information and watching things on YouTube and podcasts, the way people get this, that it seems like all the time people think things are worse than ever before. But when you frame it within, well, look what happened after World War II, countries being carved up, weapons, population transfers, all of these things, it does give a little context, and I think can help calm people down. Do people seem, from where you sit, do people seem the average person seem a little crazier about this stuff
I think
now?
I think that there's an information overload. You're drinking from a fire hose. And there's no mediation. Traditionally, the broadcast media, the newspapers decided what was important. They ranked it, front page, middle page, top of the fold, bottom of the fold. First up, is the anchor going out to this crisis, or is it just a correspondent? So you could put everything in a context of a hierarchy. Now that's no longer the case. Now your attention is constantly being demanded and assaulted by assertions that this is important, that's important, and it's left to the individual to sort these things out.
Yeah. Do you miss the old days of that as someone that's seeing the change now?
Yeah, I think it puts a pressure. I mean, I don't think that actual events, actual pressures on the United States are greater than they have been in the past. But I think the need to respond in real time immediately to every single event. I mean, somebody dies here, you got to do an obituary. Someone, there's a shooting here, you've got to come out with a statement. Means that a lot of time is wasted, may not be quite the right word, but a lot of time is spent dealing with ephemera.
Mm-hmm. So as someone that has spent their whole life basically in the thick of foreign policy, does it depress you to think about how little most Americans know about foreign policy? It's one of those things, for example, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of countries over the course of the next hour. And it's like when I see people talking about Iran or I see people talking about North Korea, and I think, man, most of these people really have no concept of what the real discussions are, what the real Iran deal says, or the mechanisms by which we can verify it, or what really is happening behind the scenes in North Korea or any of that stuff. But everyone's talking about all these things all the time. Do you think people are informed? Should they be more informed? Does a certain amount of being uninformed help a populace? What do you think?
I mean, I think the difference is that people, in the old days, people were uninformed and they knew they were uninformed. Okay. Today they're uninformed and they think they're not.
This is an incredible distinction you're making right there.
And so they have strong opinions based on data which may or may not be of any reliability. And they're not, and there's no longer a deference to expertise. This is true not just in diplomacy. I mean, there are people who won't get vaccinated despite the fact that all the doctors tell them they should vaccinate their children.
Sure.
So there's simply less deference to expertise. There's less deference to science. There's less deference to government, and that's over time. That's quite dangerous.
Yeah. So, what are some of the just broad things that people should know about foreign policy? I know I'm giving you a sort of wide one there, but just the general. Like, I just feel like people just don't understand anything. For example, right now, I want to talk a little bit about North Korea, but as an example, Trump is using a lot of over-the-top language related to North Korea. And then the North Koreans are using a lot of over-the-top language related to us. Now, to me, that has a lot to do with deterrence, and with Trump especially, it's an element of what's this guy actually thinking, which actually could be potentially good to stop enemies, that sort of thing. But what are just some of the basic things people should know about foreign policy in general?
Well, I mean, foreign policy is mostly about, on the one hand, it's mostly about relations between states. Now, there are non-states like the Islam, like terrorist movements and others, but mostly you're dealing with states, governments, bureaucracies, institutions. And so diplomacy is about knowing how states and institutions work and how they can be influenced. Where is the levers that you can push that'll get a government to do what you want to do or not do what you don't want them to do. But secondarily, institutions are made up of people, and in the end, it's all about how to influence individual people, which normally involves building a degree of trust. At least operational trust within a narrow spectrum of, if I do this, will you do that, and can I count on you to actually follow through? So in the end, it comes down to, after you get through the understanding the mechanics of international relations, of how institutions work and how to influence them, it comes down to the interpersonal relations and how to actually talk to individuals directly or indirectly, and how to get people to change their mind, to enter into meaningful bargains, and to keep their promises.
How much does that change from administration to administration? As someone that worked under several presidents, Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, how much does that all come from the top, and they sort of lay out what their vision is, and then the individuals at all the departments sort of just take that and run with it? Or are there things from administration to administration that sort of just remain basic policy?
Well, I think there was more continuity, particularly during the Cold War, from one administration to another. There were differences of emphasis. The rhetoric changed. Politicians tended to to give the impression that there were more changes than in fact took place.
Right. So I guess
So
that's
they were
really what I'm
operating
asking,
within
yeah.
a narrow spectrum of what was possible and feasible. So that's one thing. That has eroded. There now are wider variations, I think. But again, I would say, I mean, the current situation really is abnormal. There's no real comparison. You can compare Carter to Reagan or Clinton to Bush, you know, but those were still within a fairly narrow spectrum of difference. So we're in an unparalleled era of discontinuity in that regard. Now, in terms of administrations, new administrations with inexperienced presidents who've not dealt with national security before, and that's true of almost a lot of presidents.
Sure.
I mean, Reagan, Carter, George W. Bush, Clinton, Kennedy. These people had no national security experience when they entered office. It was a rarity. George H.W. Bush, you know, had a lot, but he was unusual. They make early and big mistakes, and then get better over time. If they have a second term, they're usually more successful in the second term than the first term. If you look at, you know, Kennedy's Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba that went bad the first few weeks in office, LBJ's decision to reinforce and greatly expand the U.S. commitment in Vietnam early on in his tenure, Clinton's debacle in Somalia, which again occurred in the first few weeks in his office, and of course the worst of all, George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in his first year and a half in office. So costly mistakes, improved performance later on. You can see the second terms of presidents tend to be the ones that leave the most meaningful legacies behind. And again, I think we're in a unusual period. I mean, so far, Trump hasn't made the kind of costly mistake that I've suggested others have made, others who were better prepared for the job than he was. So far we've been lucky in that regard. Will the luck hold? Will he continue on balance to take the advice of people like Mattis and Tillerson and McMaster's, who do have experience and who who are playing a restraining role to some degree? I just don't know.
Yeah. But so basically you like the team that he's assembled, I sense, from the way you said that you think that basically this is a trustworthy group, even if you have your reservations about his decision making or his outlook in general.
I think the national security team are mostly mainstream representatives of the national security establishment. I think many of them, you know, could have been as easily appointed by Hillary Clinton. I'm sure Hillary Clinton would have been perfectly satisfied with Mattis as you know, or McMaster as senior people in her administration. I think Tillerson is a bit of an enigma because his policy instincts seem to be sound. He seems to have formed a team with Mattis and McMaster to kind of create you know, channels to keep the president from going off the rails. But his handling of the State Department is almost inexplicable. I mean, he's right that it was top-heavy, that it needed to be streamlined, that the number of bureaus and special envoys and senior people needed to be cut back. First time I went to John Kerry's staff meeting, I was surprised 100 people showed up for his morning staff meeting.
Right.
I mean, it was ludicrous.
Right, and half of them were probably just assistants.
Well, no,
coffee.
I mean, most of them thought they worked for the Secretary of State, you know, directly. It had just gotten out of control. But the idea that you can have, you know, you can launch a study and not appoint anybody for a year while you think about this, the world's just moving too quickly.
Yeah. So do you think that Tillerson might actually be good at getting rid of some of that waste, cutting?
Oh, I think he's already started in that degree. But I mean, he's also he stopped hiring, so you don't, I mean, the Foreign Service is like the military. It's a career service. You come in at the bottom, you gradually rise to the top. So you got to keep replenishing your seed corn. You need those guys who just came out of grad school and who are going to rise over 30 or 40 years to positions of seniority. And if you have a 4-year hiatus in hiring, you're going to have serious problems later on.
Yeah, so it's interesting what you mentioned, where you laid out a few of the mistakes or the probably well-intentioned wrong events that presidents got themselves into at the beginning of their administrations. And yet you're acknowledging that, I mean, we're basically a year into Trump, or almost a year at this point, and he hasn't gotten into one of those. So when he's doing all of this, the high-level rhetoric and saying, we're going to wipe North Korea off, or it's going to be the hellfire of whatever it is he says. Now, from what I understand, you don't really trust him in and of himself, but what do you make of just the deterrence factor of that? Because I'll see a lot of people responding and saying, you see, he's trying to start World War III. And again, while I have no idea what's going on in his mind, I hear some of those statements and I think maybe he's really playing some high-level game of, we have no idea what this guy is going to do, and that actually is what deterrence is all about. Am I giving him too much credit there, do you think?
Well, first of all, I don't think deterrence is about not knowing what your adversary is going to do. It's quite the contrary. It's knowing where the red lines are, and that if you step across them, the consequences are going to be horrific.
Right, but is there some level of deterrence if you just don't know what that person is going to do? So if Trump says all of these things, we're going to create hellfire on earth or whatever it is, that is a level of deterrence, right? It may be not in the traditional sense. I understand what you're saying.
It creates a large zone in which the other party doesn't know where the real red lines are, how far they can actually go. So it can have exactly the opposite consequences of what you intend. It can lead them to believe that steps that they take are not going to lead to an escalation that do. So I mean, deterrence is about deterrence as a strategy for dealing with the mutual assured destructive, with the fact that if you get into an actual conflict with a nuclear power, it's over. Now North Korea isn't yet a nuclear power of the type that can destroy the United States, but it's certainly China, Russia are countries where if you escalate to a nuclear war, it will be the end of the United States as a society, and the end of Russia, and possibly the end of mankind, depending on how far this goes. So that's a powerful deterrent, and you need to establish some sense of what are the rules of the game. Yes, you can do this, and then we'll do that, and we'll play tit for tat, and if you support them, we'll support their enemies, and we'll get into a proxy conflict. But if you, on the other hand, if you cross this line, then you're going to be in a direct confrontation, which leads to a catastrophe. So this kind of loose talk and the uncertainties it creates, I think, is the opposite of a strategy of deterrence. Now, it may be a bargaining tactic, but the problem with that is that Trump is and has said that that he's used to deals that you can walk away from. That you make an offer, if you don't get the right, you bluff, you push. And then if you don't get the right response, you just walk away. He's not in games you can walk away from.
Right.
These are games that are going to continue into the future indefinitely. You're going to be dealing with rogue regimes and dangerous enemies in perpetuity. And so these are not games where you can play for a while and decide, okay, the bluff didn't work, and I'll go on to the next deal with somebody else.
Yeah, I think the distinction about rational actors is important. So perhaps we're dealing with an irrational actor as our president, and certainly the North Koreans have what seems to be an irrational actor, as opposed to the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. We had basically rational actors that weren't going to have their own countries blown apart just because something moved along in a way that they didn't like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I think that's right. I think by and large, both sides avoided the kind of rhetoric which could lead to misunderstandings, miscalculation. Now, there were a few points, particularly during the first term of Ronald Reagan, where the rhetoric had become quite heated, the evil empire sort of rhetoric, where the Soviet Union, we now know from Soviet records, was on a hair trigger. There was one incident in which a Soviet colonel saw missile trails heading toward Moscow and decided that it was an electronic ghost and didn't launch the rockets, which his instructions had him doing. There was another point at which, after a lot of rhetoric, we conducted a nuclear exercise in which we exercised conducting a nuclear strike, and the Soviet Union thought that was a real preparation for a nuclear strike, and again came quite close to perceiving this as a preemptive American strike. And again, we now know this from the records at the time.
Yeah.
So we were closer a couple of times to the kind of misunderstanding that could have been catastrophic than we sensed at the time. But you're right that both sides understood the consequences of a miscalculation and were very careful to avoid it.
Yeah.
And both sides were in communications established. I mean, Trump saying, don't talk, no need to talk to Little Rocket Man. We put hotlines in between Moscow and Washington precisely so that we would always have a reliable form of communication, even in the worst of circumstances.
Yeah. When you see him tweet things like that, like Little Rocket Man and all that stuff, do you think there's any chance that type of decision to tweet something like that is getting to Tillerson before he says it? So, like is he saying to Tillerson, I'm going to tweet something kind of crazy, but you're still going to handle everything? Or you think there's just an absolute disconnect there?
I think I don't think anybody sees the president's tweets before he makes them. I mean, he makes them at 6 in the morning when no one else has come to work.
Right.
And he makes them based on whatever he's seen in Fox News or some other media source. I think what happened on the Tillerson tweet was that Tillerson went further than the White House, including not just Trump, probably not just Trump, but the White House as a whole, went in acknowledging that we had put out feelers to the North Koreans. And the White House didn't want that known because they felt that weakened their position, that it looked like we were caving, that we were the demander in this negotiation. So I think, and the president stomped on it. You can say that it was Tillerson's fault potentially because he hadn't cleared what he said with the White House, or if he did, they didn't clear it with the president. So I think the president was the one who was taken unawares by Tillerson. Then, of course, Tillerson was taken unawares by what the president did.
Yeah. So as somebody that's
I'm almost positive they didn't orchestrate this.
Right. And I don't think he's orchestrating it per se, but it would almost be like there would be this unsaid pact where he's going, I'm going to tweet crazy stuff, and you're just going to sort of clean up the mess. But again, we're not mind readers here.
That may be the implicit understanding.
Yeah.
Yes.
But we just, unfortunately, we just don't. I don't know if anyone knows what the answer is.
No,
to
I mean,
that.
I think it's clear that Trump wanted steady, experienced people in the national security arena. It didn't hire ideologues as a rule. Didn't hire people with strong contrary opinions. In that, quickly moved Bannon out of the National Security Council because he wanted that source of stability. Probably because he understands that there are consequences for going too far, but clearly that's only sort of one pole, if you will, of his approach, and the other pole is this more instinctual, not to say impulsive, behavior based on a lifetime of experience in a different kind of negotiating environment.
Yeah, it's interesting to me how much of this really is based on trust. I mean, you have to trust the people that you're working with in the State Department, but you have to trust the actors that you're talking to on the other side to act rationally. So I'm curious, sometimes when our presidents have said things, so Trump now says things that it's a little unclear whether they're true or not, or whether they're bluffs or not, or whatever it is, but something like the Obama red line in Syria, that, he said to the Assad regime, if you use chemical weapons, this is the red line, we're going to do something. And then we didn't. I was doing on-air stuff at the time, and I remember I did not want to go in. I thought we can leave this to Turkey or Saudi Arabia or create some humanitarian corridors or something. So I did not want it. But to me, once you set the red line, then you have to actually do something. Do you think that's a fair assessment to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an issue of credibility, and again, I think there's an issue of predictability. If you set red lines and then don't follow them, you've undermined the credibility of any future red lines that you may set. And clearly, Obama's credibility, had diminished as a result of this. Now, I think it's a little unfair that he didn't, he said, if you use chemical weapons, we'll respond. Then the Russians said, well, how about if we get them to dismantle all their chemical weapons? And Obama grabbed that as a neat way out. Mm-hmm. And I think if that was an isolated case, if that you could argue that was an appropriate response and a nice outcome. They'd used chemical weapons once. You were going to bomb them so they didn't do it again. Well, this was even better. They not only weren't going to do it again, they weren't even going to be able to do it again because they were going to get rid of them all. So,
assuming we trusted that whole process, right?
Well, I mean, I think it wasn't so much a question of trust. They got rid of huge amounts of chemical weapons. Now, the fact that they may have retained a little bit is fine. But the fact is, I mean, we know that tons and tons of chemical weapons were, in fact, handed over and destroyed, mostly by us. Mm-hmm. So I think in an isolated case that was, but personally I think we should have intervened more forcefully in Syria before the opposition had become radicalized, while they were winning and the regime was losing, at a point where the regime was sovereign only in the air. On the ground they were losing. It was only in the air that they were unchallenged. We could have destroyed the Syrian Air Force overnight without losing a man or a plane in all likelihood. They would have lost the one area where they were superior, and they would have either been forced to some kind of compromise or have lost the war, in my judgment, by that simple act back in 2012, say. But by the time you had the red line and that debate, the opposition had become so radicalized that they were actually worse than Assad. And so you really didn't want them to win. There were elements of them you'd like to win, but you couldn't separate the bad from the good in the opposition. And the ongoing war was just a catastrophe for the region, and it destabilized the politics in Europe, and even to a limited degree destabilized the politics in the United States.
Yeah, it's incredible how that one conflict within Syria, I mean, it's led to the immigration crisis across Europe. It had definitely something to do with some of the sentiment that led to the rise of Trump here. So what is the United States supposed to do, or what do you think the right thing for the United States to do is in a situation like that, where now we, in effect, have two bad actors, that there's no good side here, that at least that I know of, and yet there's, I think it's over 300,000 people have been killed in the last 5 or 7 years. It's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions. What actually is the right thing to do if we don't have an actor to play with?
It's obviously situationally developed. I think in 2012, we should have intervened on the part of an opposition force which was legitimate, which was democratic, which was moderate, and which was winning.
Yeah.
I think today the situation is very different. I think today the quicker the war is over, the better for us. We don't like the fact that Iran and Russia have influence. The best way of diminishing their influence is diminish the need for Assad to depend on them. So getting the war over, allowing Assad to prevail, is probably the fastest way. It doesn't eliminate Russian and Syrian influence, but it'll certainly diminish it as he'll become less dependent. Mm-hmm. I think that we're moving toward at least an interim equilibrium in which you have a U.S. protected zone in the east of the country where the Kurds are operating. You have a Turkish protected zone in the north of the country, which is separating the two Kurdish enclaves. You have a protected zone in the south of the country near the Israeli border, which the Russians, the U.S., the Jordanians, and the Israelis have worked out, which again creates a zone of tranquility, if you will. And then Assad basically consolidates his hold over the rest. And then the question is, what's the next step? This will be an interim low violence situation. Some people are already going back. The inflows into Syria are now slightly up more than the outflows. But
so people who actually left the country because of the war are actually starting to come back.
Some are limited numbers. I mean, there's like, I don't know the exact number, but like millions and abroad, and tens of thousands are coming back. So
I mean, even that's something, yeah.
So I mean, I think the main instrument we will have to influence the course of Syria is whether we provide or withhold. I mean the international community, Europe, the United States, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the World Bank, the IMF. Do we provide or withhold reconstruction assistance? And what can we get for it?
Yeah.
So I think, consolidating an interim ceasefire in the country along the current battle lines, probably maintaining a small U.S. presence in that protected zone of the Kurds in the east for a while until the Kurds and the regime come to some understanding about limited autonomy for their region. And beginning reconstruction tied to genuine elections, not at national level. You're not going to get rid of Assad, but local elections we will provide assistance to any city or town that holds a local election and has a democratically elected local council who can help guide the reconstruction. And we'll do it town by town based on a criteria as to whether there's a representative, balanced local council there, and try to build a new generation of leadership bottom up, and use the reconstruction assistance from the international community more broadly as a lever to promote gradual and change within a system that's going to be dominated by Assad for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, is that in effect what we did in Iraq before we pulled out? I mean, there were actual democratic elections there. There was some local control that was good. We saw some seeds of liberalism popping up, and then we left, and it's probably worse, certainly worse now than it was at that point. Is that in effect what we did there?
Well, I mean, it was a little different in the sense that that in his second term, Bush surged American troops into Iraq, crushed the insurgency, which was an al-Qaeda-linked insurgency, worked with the regime to crush a similar Shia insurgency that was supported by Iran. And so both of those insurgencies were crushed. You did have some equilibrium between the Kurdish, the Shia, and the Sunni polities within that society that had achieved a certain equilibrium. A significant American continued role was probably necessary to counterbalance Iranian influence, to continue to professionalize the Iraqi security forces, and to provide leverage to sustain that delicate and difficult balance among the groups. And our decision to leave withdrew that element of stability, and the situation deteriorated. So yes, but I mean, it was different in the sense that we had he had gone all in, and with 170,000 troops and a major campaign to suppress both of the extremist, the Shia and Sunni extremists in the country, and established its right equilibrium. In Syria, it's a little different. I mean, we've supported the insurgents against the regime, but we didn't support them enough. We were giving them just enough aid to continue the war, but not enough to win it.
It's interesting because it sort of harkens back to what you started with about the continuity between administrations, because if I remember correctly, so when Obama was running against Hillary as the Democratic nominees back then, 2007, that one of the things that he was really hitting her on was she was saying we're going to have to stay in Iraq a little bit longer. And he basically was saying we're getting out, we're getting out, we're getting out, which in effect is what he did, even though it was signed by George W. Bush that we were leaving before, but obviously we could have done whatever we wanted. But in effect what you're saying is, had we stayed a little bit longer, perhaps some of those institutions would have been strengthened, right? So it was it's sort of no-win in a way, because if you don't want to be there forever, there's a problem, and if you leave too soon after we've gone in and done as much as George W. Bush did, then you're still kind of in a bad spot.
Yes, I mean, there's no simple solutions. I mean, clearly it was a mistake to have invaded Iraq in the first place. But it was also a mistake to leave once we'd done it. We're in the same situation in Afghanistan, and I think on balance, Trump's probably made the right decision there. I mean, his choices in Afghanistan were either to lose or not lose. There wasn't a third choice to win. I mean, that's not an option. So the choice is either leave and watch the place return to the Taliban and become a haven for Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, other forms of extremism, or continue to support the government, establish some equilibrium in the state which doesn't defeat the Taliban, but which prevents them from gaining further ground. So each of these situations requires, I don't think there's a template that you can simply apply in each of these cases. I think each of them requires a specific solution. Sometimes the solution is to leave. Sometimes the solution is to stay. Sometimes the solution is to commit more, to intensify the commitment.
By that estimation, are we going to be in Afghanistan forever? I mean, if there's no win here, and it's either stay and play ball, and it's not great, and we're spending a lot of resources, or leave and watch it go to hell, how could we ever get out? It's the longest war in American history, I think, at this point.
Well, that's a little misleading because the first few years there really wasn't much in the way of violence, and we weren't. It was more so the war didn't really intensify until about 2006. But even then, it's a long war. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the point is, I can't remember the statistics, but I mean, we're losing. I think this year we've lost like 8 people. Okay, we probably we lose more soldiers in traffic accidents in the United States. Mm-hmm. You know, in all likelihood, I don't know the statistics. We lost more people in Las Vegas than we've lost in Vietnam in the last. We lost in Afghanistan in the last several years. So you know, we've been in Germany forever. We've been in South Korea forever. Yeah. We still have troops in Kosovo. Nobody's complaining about that. You know, we launched an operation in Kosovo. Now it's 18 years ago. Mm-hmm. Still there. We only have a few hundred. Nobody's shooting at them, so nobody cares. Yeah. So the answer is, how long can you stay in Afghanistan at current levels, engaged in the kinds of activities we're engaged in? I think we can stay a long time. It's not high on the American political agenda. Nobody's arguing we should leave. Nobody of consequence. Trump's statement was mildly criticized by some, but there's no demonstrations in the streets. Mm-hmm.
What would you say to those people, though, for the few that there may be in the public sphere that would just say, we need to get out of all of these places? Why do we have soldiers in, I think there's something, how many? It's something like 20 or 30,000 soldiers in Germany, you know, many, many years after World War II, or that we have these soldiers in South Korea. Putting Afghanistan aside here, what would you say to those people that, well, why do we have any of these people here? Don't these countries have armies and borders, and what do they need us for?
You know, I mean, despite the appearance of disarray and the level of conflict that we see in the evening news, we've lived through the most peaceful and prosperous period in human history. There hasn't been a war between a major state since the Korean War, so 1954. There hasn't been a single war between 2 major states. There have been lots of small civil wars. They reached their peak actually at the end of the Cold War in the early 90s. So at that point you had about 40 civil wars going on, and throughout the 90s most of those were extinguished. We're now at a period of growth again, so we're seeing more of these small civil wars going on, Syria being an example. But still, I mean, in terms of the way most humanity lives, this has been the most peaceful and the most prosperous era in human history. Something like, you know, more than 1 billion people were lifted out of poverty over the last decade and a half. and so the fact that you had an American superpower that was prepared to underwrite an international system that was based on certain norms, the biggest norm being you don't invade your neighbor, that conquest is not a legitimate basis for changing your borders, and then a whole bunch of subsidiary norms and institutions like the World Bank, like the International Monetary Fund, like the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. All of these have created a structure that hasn't eliminated conflict, but it's definitely circumscribed it, kept it away from our shores, and would you want to go back to a situation like the 19th century, the 18th century, or even the first half of the 20th century, which was the bloodiest period in human history? And would you want to go back to a world like that with an increasing number of countries that have nuclear weapons? Well, how do you stop them from having nuclear weapons? Well, the way we've stopped our allies from having nuclear weapons is to protect them.
Right.
And so why do we have troops in Germany? So that Germany doesn't become a nuclear-armed superpower again. Why do we have troops in Japan? So Japan doesn't become a nuclear-armed superpower again. Same for South Korea. Do you want to replicate the kind of situation we had in the 1930s, again, in a world in which a miscalculation could essentially end humanity as we know it?
Yeah, so you briefly mentioned the UN there. What do you make of what's happening with the UN right now? It seems that Trump really has turned this thing on its head. Nikki Haley is going in there and saying we're not going to do things as they've been done. She's changing the way we're going to vote on the Security Council, that sort of thing. Do you sense that?
I think that's mostly rhetoric. I mean, the UN is an instrument. If you can if people agree, then it's a useful instrument. If they can't agree, then it's stymied. I mean, it was designed that way. It's not the UN's fault. If the Russians won't agree and block a Security Council, you don't have a Security Council mandate. If you don't have a Security Council mandate, whatever you do is going to be more controversial. It's going to get less support. This is just the way the system works. But I think Haley has actually been rather successful in moderating and explaining American policy in terms that are more broadly acceptable. American administrations, because we're the richest country in the world, so we pay the highest amount of the UN's dues. I think we pay like 22%. And so we're always arguing that it should be more efficient and spend less money. That's not new to this administration. Every administration takes that view. So I don't see the Trump administration at this point being particularly disruptive in terms of the UN as an institution.
Huh. A couple times you've mentioned the Kurds. I think the plight of the Kurds is one of the most sort of underreported stories. They just had a vote this week as we're taping this, just a few days ago, on statehood. I think it was something like 95% said yes. But people don't seem to understand that they're sort of caught in between Turkey and Iraq and Syria, and that they're an ethnic minority trying to figure out what their actual land and country can be. What is our policy related to the Kurds? It's hard to tell.
Well, I mean, the Kurds are distributed pretty evenly between Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. They're a minority in all of those countries. They'd of course like to unite and create a country of their own, but that means carving up 4 other countries. Right. And there's not much enthusiasm about that. So I think that what the Kurds in Iraq had achieved, which is a high degree of autonomy. They had their own army. They had considerable control over their own resources. It was about the best that they could expect. And anything more radical was going to be opposed by these other countries, largely because of the precedent it would set for their own Kurds. I think we've learned again and again, the breakup of Yugoslavia being the first post-war example, that breaking up is hard to do, that it's costly, that it involves unwilling population transfers, ethnic cleansing, even genocide. Populations are intermixed to the degree that there's no clear separations. And finding a way to live together is almost always a a better solution and one that's less likely to generate conflict, death, migration, and the pressures that brings on the international system. So, I mean, our position is clear on northern Iraq, that is to say Kurdish Iraq, which is we don't want an independent Kurdistan. The Iraqi constitution creates a framework for them to bargain with the government, including even bargaining potentially a peaceful breakup of the country, as Czechoslovakia broke into Czech Republic and Slovakia without any violence. But they have to pursue that path. And that a violent breakup, a breakup against the Constitution that we helped write, is going to lead to just further chaos in the region.
Do we have a policy related to the rest of the Kurds? So I understand what you're saying about the KRG in Iraq.
The Syrian Kurds are Maoist communists, which nobody reports on because they're fighting the Islamic State.
Yeah,
they're also associated with the PKK, which is the terrorist movement of Kurds in Turkey that are fighting the Turkish government. But they've been reliable and very capable allies in the fight against the Islamic State, and so we owe them a debt, and I think have a need to continue to support a modest expression of their aspirations, which is to create an autonomous zone, something like what exists in Iraq, where they can continue to govern themselves within a Syrian federation, but with a great deal of local autonomy. I think that's the best they can get. If they push it beyond that, they'll unite Syria, Iraq, and Turkey against them, and we're not going to be able to protect them.
Yeah, is that the inherent problem of this? That telling them, well, this is all you can have. All you can have is this semi-autonomous place in Iraq, even though there's plenty of you in Turkey and Syria and Iran. That while I can understand it from a diplomatic position why that makes sense, that just simply may not be enough for those people.
It may not. I mean, we faced this when Yugoslavia broke up, beginning in the late 90s, or actually in the early 90s under George H.W. Bush. Mm-hmm. And the dilemma was that if it broke up, it was going to be violent, and yet it was going to break up. So your policy choices were to acknowledge the inevitable and acquiesce in it, and share responsibility for the resultant carnage, or oppose it, avoid responsibility. You still had the resulting carnage, but at least you weren't responsible for it. You didn't encourage it. You didn't endorse it.
Right.
You know, millions of people were going to be dispossessed. Hundreds of thousands were going to be killed. Did you want to endorse that, or did you want to oppose it? Mm-hmm. And the answer is we normally want to oppose it. Now the question is, can you oppose it effectively enough to prevent it?
Right.
That's hard. That's expensive. But opposing it enough to just say, not our fault, that's easy. And the alternative would be to say, let's work with it. It's going to happen. Let's try to make it happen as peacefully as we can. And the problem there is that you're probably not going to be able to be influential enough to succeed, and you're going to buy the result. You're going to be tarred with the result. And so that's the policymaker's dilemma.
Right, or I guess you're selling the result to the person that's going to come after you, and either way, something bad is going to happen. Let's talk about two other places that we've hit on a little bit here. So Iran, right now I'm seeing a whole bunch of chatter on Twitter. I'm probably spending too much time on Twitter, but chatter on Twitter about that the Iran deal is actually not working, that they're not doing what they have to do. We don't have a way of verifying all of this. What's your basic thoughts on the deal in the first place, and then sort of where we're at?
Well, I mean, the deal as written is certainly working. It's working exactly as it was written. Obama certified that every 90 days, and Trump has certified it twice. Mm-hmm. Written, certified, it's working. They're doing everything they're required to do.
Meaning we have verified everything in the signed document. Okay.
Yes, that we're completely satisfied that they're doing everything they're supposed to do. Mm-hmm. So Trump has twice certified that to be true to the Congress. So the complaint that, and there's intrusive verification by the IAEA inspectors, and the U.S. intelligence community is completely unified in saying, yes, they're doing what they promised to do. There's really no factual dispute there, despite whatever you may be reading on the internet.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah. So there are two levels of complaint that have some basis. One is the agreement doesn't go far enough, so it doesn't cover their missile program. It doesn't stop them from providing missiles to Hezbollah that can strike Israel. It doesn't stop them from supporting Assad. It doesn't stop them from supporting the Houthis, Shia minority in Yemen. It doesn't stop them from supporting Shia in Bahrain. It doesn't stop them from making the Saudis miserable.
So basically, that's just a criticism of the deal that was signed.
So and the answer was it wasn't intended to do that, and it also didn't. The agreement doesn't require us to lift all our sanctions. It only required us to lift the sanctions we put on connected with their nuclear program. And all the sanctions we put on because of their human rights record and their attacks on Israel and their behavior elsewhere, those sanctions all continue to exist. And we can continue to add to them. Okay, so that's that level of complaint.
Do you see that as a legitimate complaint, that somehow that all should have been tied together? Or
no, I think you
get
thing. What you can. I don't think... To solve all those other things, we would have had to make much broader concessions ourselves, which we weren't prepared to make.
Okay.
The second complaint is that some of the aspects of the agreement run out. Some goes for 10 years, some 15. They haven't just said they're not going to make nuclear weapons. They've halted a wide range of nuclear activities. And shipped out highly enriched uranium, stopped enriching uranium to a certain level, closed down certain reactors. In other words, there's a lot of things, and these things are time-phased. They all last at least 10 years. Some of them last a bit longer, and some of them terminate. But so do our promise not to apply sanctions terminates too. So yes, at some point in the next 10 years, we should sit down and either extend the existing agreement or, better yet, supplement it with an even wider agreement that covers other issues. But that's a problem we've got a decade to solve. And just walking away from the agreement, I mean, walking away from the agreement, there's two alternatives. What are the alternatives? One is they resume their nuclear program and have nuclear weapons within a year. Alternative two is we go to war to stop them. A war with Iran doesn't end in a month or a year. We'd have to do what we did with Iraq from the end of the first Gulf War until the invasion of Iraq, which is overfly them every day, bomb them every time we see them doing something suspicious. And essentially it's a permanent conflict. But it's much more difficult because with Iraq, we had a Security Council resolution that authorized us to overfly them every day and bomb them whenever we saw suspicious activity.
People forget that we actually did go to the UN for that. Actually.
Right, and we had bases in neighboring countries like Turkey. The British and the French also overflew Iraq every day and bombed them when they did something suspicious. And the world was perfectly content with that and endorsed it. But if we walk away from this agreement, we're not going to have a Security Council resolution that authorizes us to go to war. We're not going to have any allies in that war. We're going to be the one that's isolated. And so which do you want, a war with Iran or Iran with nuclear weapons? Those are your alternatives. Or keep the existing agreement and negotiate a follow-on with more provisions.
Right. So that it's an interesting way of looking at it, that basically this bought us, it didn't do everything, all those issues that you mentioned, but it also bought us some time here to hopefully deal with some of that, while at the same time, when this thing sets 10 years from now or whatever it is now, 8 years from now, that we can then renegotiate and hopefully we'll be in a better position for whatever reason, or the regime won't be as strong, or a series of other things that we just won't know. So it's a diplomatic win on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it was, you bought 10 years, and, problems, the problems that are crises that are postponed often just go away.
Yeah.
So, we postponed a crisis with the Soviet Union for 40 years, and it went away.
Right.
Right?
So we shall see on this one.
Yeah.
Let's shift to North Korea a little bit. We just did a show on North Korea with Michael Malice, who's an author and a journalist who spent some time there. But I do sense that people really don't know too much about North Korea or understand the actors and everything that's going on here. What's the sort of simplest way you can describe the regime and how they behave?
Well, it's a very personalized regime. It's a family regime. You're now in the third generation of leaders. It's isolated. It's highly authoritarian. It's brutal. It has no democratic legitimacy, and it makes no effort to achieve it. It governs by intimidation, propaganda, and it's a national security state. It sees itself as beleaguered. It is beleaguered, largely as a result of its own behavior. It believes that South Korea wants it to go away, wants to reunify Korea, which of course it does. So does North Korea want to unify Korea. It believes that the United States is hostile and bent on regime change, which in a sense we are. I mean, we want to change all authoritarian regimes in a very generalized way, but we're not actively, mounting a campaign to overthrow the regime in Pyongyang. If we thought we could, we might be tempted, but I don't think we see any real prospect there. It's a regime that was almost on its last legs a few years ago. Large-scale starvation, mismanaged economy. It's under the new leadership of Kim Jong-un. The economy has picked up, and the fear that the situation, that the regime is just going to implode, which was the principal concern of North Korea 5 or 10 years ago, was it was just going to implode. And then what were we going to do? Now, I think that's less likely, and the concern is the growing nuclear capabilities. And not so much that they will use them, although that's a danger, but that they will employ them to intimidate and threaten their neighbors, and to protect even more outrageous behavior.
We could probably do another hour on that right there, but we've actually done an hour already. But I thought we could end, this went by really quick, and I could talk about foreign policy all day, and I love hearing some of the insights that we just can't get from the average people that are talking about this stuff all the time. I know you have an interesting anecdote about Tear Down This Wall, the Reagan speech. I thought maybe we could end on that.
Yeah, this is the book that I just published called Foreign Service, which is an account of my 50 years in diplomacy. And so I was the deputy chief of mission number 2 in our embassy in West Germany, and the capital of West Germany was Bonn, not Berlin. But Reagan was going to visit Berlin, and so I flew ahead a few days before his intended trip to scout out locations for what the White House intended to be a major speech. And so I went around to several different locations, and the one I liked best was a location directly in front of the Brandenburg Gate, which is associated with Berlin, the way the Empire State is with New York.
Did you have any idea while you were searching out the spot the level of which this speech was going?
Well,
to
I didn't.
hit?
I knew it was going to be a major speech, and a major speech by a president. You'd had, of course, the Kennedy speech in Berlin, in which he said, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I'm a Berliner. Which was, a major event, and still reverberates even today. So I knew that this was going to be a symbolic and important occasion. So the location I thought was best telegenically, if you will, was in front of the Brandenburg Gate, through which Hitler's armies had marched, the Kaiser's armies had marched, which was now walled off and sealed the city. And the people in our mission in Berlin, West Berlin, said, this will be controversial. Both the East Germans and maybe the West Germans will regard this as a provocation. So maybe we should go to a little more neutral location. But I persisted, went back and talked to the White House advance team and sold them on the location. I didn't know that he was going to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And in fact, there's an anecdote in which he's driving to the event and someone on the White House staff tells him that he ought to drop that line.
Yeah.
And he says, no, I think it'll be okay. And so that's probably, the single most important, single presidential speech that still reverberates most.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I love talking about foreign policy. There's so much more we could do. Will you come back and do this again sometime?
Sure, I'd love to.
All right, we will do this again sometime. And you're not huge on Twitter, which I think is the key to your whole operation. But you are Jim. But you are on Twitter, yes. Jim_Dobbins, and we're going to link to a few of his works down below.